Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and I feel very blessed to be able to be with you and to share this time of Bible study with you. Today, we're beginning the third unit of a four-unit series on the life of Joseph. And we've been not just looking at the story of Joseph, but we've been looking at how God, in His grace, is a background part of that whole story of Joseph, because it's Joseph's faith in God and God's grace towards Joseph and his intention for good, which is the unit title, how God's all these things work together for good. And in spite of the fact that they seem so disjointed sometimes, and sometimes you think, how could this be part of God's plan? And yet, God's plan has taken that into account and works around it, as He does in our own lives. And so Joseph's life story here gives us a good idea of ways that God shows His grace to us. And that emphasis on grace has been seen in each one of the lessons. The purpose statement for our first lesson was to affirm that we need grace. And in that lesson, we looked at Joseph and his brothers and that sibling rivalry because he was favored by their father, and how that led them to do the very inappropriate thing of selling him as a slave, and then allowing their father to believe that he had been killed by a wild animal or lost his life in some way in the wilderness. The next lesson we talked about the purpose statement there being to recognize that God's grace doesn't eliminate all tough times. No, God's grace doesn't mean that we will not have any tough times, but it does mean that no matter how tough the times get, no matter how unclear it seems to us how God is working in a situation, we can have faith and assurance that He is doing just that. Prevenient grace is something us Methodists talk about a lot, and it's God's grace that draws us unto Him. It's the grace by which He interacts with us even before we have made that personal commitment to Him of faith. He seeks us because He loves us, and He wants that relationship with us, that prevenient grace. Well, today we're going to continue on in the story. Joseph had been sold into slavery. When he got to Egypt, he was sold to a official of the court, and he, again, in that official's household, showed great organizational ability, great insight, great understanding, and before long he was promoted to where Potiphar made him the head of his household, so that Potiphar could be freed up to take care of the governmental things and the other responsibilities that he had. That came to a rather abrupt end after a bad situation with Potiphar's wife, and Joseph finds himself in jail. As we talked about last week, here's one of those times when Joseph could have said, as we often say, Lord, are you sure you're with me in this? It seems like even though what I'm doing is sometimes leading to good things and I'm being recognized and I'm being given positions of authority, here comes old devil in and just cuts my feet right out from under me and turns it all into nothing. And here I am now in jail. And yet Joseph, by faith, continued to be the person that God had created him to be, to use that wisdom and insight that he had, that giftedness that God had created in him. And he again rose to a position of having some authority and having some respect there, even there in the prison system. And at the end of that story, we find the Pharaoh's wine steward and baker being placed in the jail for a while, sort of like while they were investigating a situation where these two servants of Pharaoh's were found to be maybe a part of a plot or some kind of misdeed related to Pharaoh. And so they were held in the prison while they investigated. During that time, both of them had dreams, and Joseph was able to show how God had gifted him with the ability to understand dreams. He talks with the wine steward, and he tells him, he interprets the wine steward's dream, and he tells him, you are going to be restored to your position of responsibility, and you're going to return to service for Pharaoh. The baker, he didn't have such good news for. He said, you, on the other hand, are not going to be returned to service. In fact, you're going to be put to death. You're going to be found guilty of whatever the crime is that he was there for, and you'll be put to death. Well, that happened, just as Joseph had said. And the wine steward, as he's leaving prison, he tells Joseph, I won't forget you, Joseph. And then here we go today, chapter 41 of Genesis. And it's been 2 years since that wine steward told Joseph, I won't forget you, Joseph. But he did forget him. He placed all that knowledge of Joseph back on the back burner. He got involved in his role as the wine steward and busyness of the day. And before long, he wasn't even thinking about Joseph anymore until in chapter 41, we find Pharaoh himself having a dream. A vivid dream, a dream that was not an ordinary kind of dream. It was a startling kind of dream. And when he awoke, he was unsettled by this dream. And he called together his magicians and his government officials, his advisors. He said, ask them, he presented them with the dream, and he asked them if any of them could interpret that dream, had any sense of what the dream meant. But none of them did. Even though they could speculate and hypothesize about some things, none of those things really sounded very legitimate. And so Pharaoh discounted those and wasn't at all satisfied with that. And it's at that point that the wine steward remembers Joseph and steps forward and says, Pharaoh, remember back when I was under investigation and I had to go to the prison for a while. While I was there, I met a man named Joseph, and he was able to interpret my dream. Maybe he can interpret your dream as well. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph. And Joseph is brought before Pharaoh. Here's one of those golden opportunities. I mean, here is a prisoner being elevated to this point where he is allowed an audience with Pharaoh. And they clean him up and get him ready to go and put him on fresh new clothes, and he goes in to see Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, I understand that you have the ability to interpret dreams. And Joseph, as being the true to God, faithful person that he is, he says, no, Pharaoh, it's not really me that interprets dreams. God is able to interpret dreams, and God just allows me to have the insight to understand what dreams mean. But it's God's work and God's plan. And God sent you that dream. And so Pharaoh describes his dream to Joseph. He says, in my dream, I was standing by the Nile, and up out of the Nile comes 7 cows. Beautiful cows, well filled out and muscular. They were just, you could just think about, oh my, a herd of those kind of cows would be a wonderful asset. And then 7 of them came up out of the Nile, and they were standing there grazing on the banks of the Nile where the vegetation was thick and lush. And as they were grazing, 7 other cows came up. These cows were awful looking cows. They were skinny and lean and just looked like they were barely hanging on to life. And those 7 weak cows came up and devoured the healthy cows. And even after devouring the healthy cows, the 7 weak cows, ugly cows, hadn't changed at all. They were still just as weak and ugly and awful looking as they had been in the beginning. That was the first part of Pharaoh's dream. The second part of his dream was he saw a cornstalk, and it had 7 ears on it. Now that's an exceptional thing. I'm a gardener, and I tell you, if I can get 3 ears on a stalk of corn, I feel like I've hit a home run. Well, 7 ears would certainly be good, and certainly 7 beautiful ears, fully filled out, and everything just the best of the best kind of corn, and 7 of them on the same stalk. And then, as he's standing there looking at that stalk of corn, he sees 7 other ears bud and grow. But these ears, even after they finish growing, they have big gaps in the kernels, and they are withered looking and dried looking, not at all appetizing, and don't look like doesn't look like they have much nutrition to them or anything. And sure enough, these 7 bad ears devour the 7 good ears. Really, if you and I had a dream like that, we'd be kind of scratching our head and wondering what in the world does this mean? Uh, and certainly Pharaoh was doing that too. But Joseph said, God is sending you a message, O Pharaoh. God in his grace, here's that grace again. God in his grace is giving you a warning that there will be 7 good years. Harvest will be plentiful, the people will be prosperous, things will be just going great. But after those 7 good years, there are going to be 7 years of famine and drought, and where the crops don't produce, and where the animals aren't able to thrive, and where we're just hanging on. And he said, the fact that God sent you this dream in 2 parts emphasizes that this is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. That cycle is going to begin soon. And Pharaoh says, well, what should I do? Joseph, in a very unself-serving way, says, well, Pharaoh, you need to find a man who can be trustworthy to oversee the process, and you need to begin now gathering and storing away extra from those 7 years of abundance, so that during the 7 years of famine and want and low production, there will be food to eat. Pharaoh turned to his advisors, and they all agreed, yes, this sounds like a good plan. And Pharaoh says, well, who should I choose? And he says, wait a minute. God has given Joseph the insight to understand this problem. He's given him the insight to interpret it to me and to give me a plan. Joseph must be the man that we need to oversee this project. And so he sets Joseph in a position to have authority over this, preparing for the 7 years of famine. And he even elevates Joseph to the status of an Egyptian official, gives him an Egyptian name, gives him all the bells and whistles that go with the authority of the Pharaoh. He even gives him a wife, and Joseph is in tall cotton. I mean, things are going well for him. And he begins immediately being that good steward, that faithful servant to the Pharaoh that he was to Potiphar, that he was to the jailer, that he has been, because that's who he is. That's his nature. That's how God uses him. And he goes about throughout Egypt, and he said in each area, we're told in Scripture, in each area he has each part of Egypt to provide storage for their own needs. And it says the storage places got to be so large, and so the grain was so much that they even quit trying to count it. They even quit trying to decide how many bushels of this or that they had stored away, because it was so much. It was enough that we're told later that when the famine years hit, not only was there enough that had been stored back, but with the people using discretion and being careful, they were able not only for the Egyptians to continue and survive, but other people came in and bought grain from Joseph and from the Egyptians. And God prospered everyone in this sense. Now, isn't that grace? God took a situation where Pharaoh was given a warning, but he didn't understand that warning. And so he gave him one who had the insight to understand what was going on and encouraged him to do the right thing to prepare so that all these people wouldn't be lost to famine and to hard times. That's grace. God, by his grace, is interceding for us in all kinds of ways every day. And we just don't have the eyes to see and the ears to hear all the things that he's doing. We don't look upon everything with the eyes of faith, and we're not able to see. And yet we know that God, by his grace, is active in our world. Pause for just a minute and think, what would this world be like if God were to withdraw his grace? If God were to withdraw his influence? If God was to remove his people through whom he uses as conduits to share the goodness of God and the grace of God, what would happen if all that was taken away? I don't know about you, but that kind of fits pretty closely into my definition of hell. I've always said that hell would be the absolute, complete, and total absence of God. Hell. Well, God in his grace doesn't want to see us in hell. He wants to give us the means by which we can be his people and we can learn of him and we can receive him. And Joseph spoke so boldly and so directly. Joseph is a good example for you and I because he didn't flinch for a moment. He didn't try to boast or make himself seem important. He told Pharaoh right off, there's nothing special about me. What it is that God has chosen me to be his voice, to be his messenger. God is the one who is giving you this message. Unfortunately, we don't see a whole lot in this passage of scripture about Pharaoh pursuing God, Joseph's God. But we do see that Pharaoh responded to that sense of there is something going on here that's unseen. There's something going on here that I don't understand, and that's okay. In our world, there are things going on every day that we don't understand, that we don't know. It makes us fearful. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us lonely. As people of faith, it makes us long for a better day. And yet, in every day, in every moment, in the good times and in the bad, God's grace is there sustaining us. The purpose lesson for today, statement for today's lesson is to realize the expanse of God's grace. God's grace, the expanse of God's grace. We talk about God as being omniscient and omnipotent, omnipresent. We know that God is all things, and his grace is in all things, and his intentions are always for the good. Praise be to God. Thank you for sharing with me this lesson about Joseph and understanding that Joseph is a good example of you and I and how God can use us if we be faithful and true and trust and continue to follow his leading. I hope that you'll do that in the week ahead. I hope you'll continue to pray for one another. Pray for me. I'll pray for you. And in doing so, we'll have that special sense of God's presence in our lives that will sustain us. God bless you. Love you. Have a good week. Bye-bye.